Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I was at CES last week in Las Vegas, and so today I want to do a recap of the 10 coolest things that happened while I was there. This was my third year going to the trade show, and it feels like it's getting bigger and bigger every time. And part of that just might be the fact that I'm getting better and better at going to this place. You know, it's spread out across a bunch of different hotels and other convention centers, and I'm just kind of getting a little bit more used to it, so I tend to knock out a lot each and every day. But in the interest of keeping this relatively short and entertaining, I think we should only cover the top 10 here. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, before we actually get to those 10 items, I do want to talk a little bit about the gear that I brought and the overall experience when it comes to traveling back and forth. As you probably already know, I am located in Hawaii, and so it's just a direct flight over about 6 to 7 hours, depending on which way you're going. I do tend to pack a lot of stuff just because, I'm going to an electronics show. You never know what you're going to need, especially because I'm taking a lot of video footage. So let's actually start with my camera setup, and I honestly just use my phone every time. However, this year I did step it up quite a bit. I grabbed a new grip that I was able to put on my phone to give it a little bit more stability, and I also used a special 18mm lens. This gave me a wider angle and made everything look nice and crisp, but then also it removed distortion around the edges of the frame, which happens a lot with cell phone cameras. I'll leave links to everything that I brought down below in case you are interested in checking it out. Now, in terms of just all of my other gear, it all kind of fit in my backpack. I use this cable organizer, which I've shown in other videos, and I basically just throw in every single combination of cables that I might need. I've also got a mouse to help me with video editing, and then also I've got my AirPods in this nice little Game Boy case. Below that, I've got some other travel accessories, including some noise-canceling headphones for the plane, and then I've also got a 140-watt wall charger for my USB cables, as well as a battery, and this always comes in clutch while on those longer flights. And then I also bring a wireless controller just in case. You never know when some sort of multiplayer session might pop up, so this is the 8-bit Do SN30 Pro. In terms of gadgets, I brought my Pocket 4, so this is a small laptop that can be flipped around to become a tablet. So I used this to watch some movies. I think I watched Gladiator 2, which was okay, and then about half of the new Lord of the Rings animated movie, and that one was okay as well. And so this was just my little travel companion when it came to consuming media. When it came to actually playing games, I really just brought one for this purpose, and that was my ROG Ally X. This one has been loaded up with Bazite, and so it functions basically like a Steam Deck, and really the only game that I played the whole time was Ghost of Tsushima. I've been playing this for about a month now, and I knocked out 2 hours on each of those flights, and so I'm getting pretty far in the story, although I am pretty meticulous, so I'm taking my time and going through it. And then finally, I also brought my Trim UI brick, not necessarily to play any retro games, but to show it off to others, so I could slide this in my jacket pocket, and then when someone would ask, oh, what is it that you do? I could just pull that out, and that kind of explains everything. And it is really awesome to watch people's eyes light up when they see just how awesome these little handhelds can be. So with that out of the way, now let's talk about the 10 coolest things that happened while I was at CES, and number one easily was all the people that I met. That was really cool. To start, there were quite a few YouTubers that I met, and many of these people I've been watching for years, and so it was just crazy to actually walk up to them and be like, hey, how's it going? And realize that they don't know who I am, but I definitely know who they are. So I met people like Paul from Paul's Hardware and Jeff from Craft Computing, Austin Evans and Becca Versace. All this was really awesome. I also met who I would consider to be celebrities within the tech world, people like Jeff Keighley and Sean Hollister from The Verge, and then I also met Lawrence Yang as well as Pierre-Louis Graffet from Valve, and they're kind of the architects of the Steam Deck, so I was super nervous to meet those guys. I thought I would come up with something witty to ask them, and I just blew it. I basically just was like, nice to meet you, and I was just so thankful that they had made the Steam Deck in the first place. Anyway, yes, this was super cool to just meet some people. I was starstruck a lot of the time when I was walking around. Hey, this is Backyard/Editing Russ. I forgot to mention, but, the whole time I was there, I was hanging out with a whole crew of folks, and, it's like people like the Retro Handhelds guys and ETA Prime and stuff. So I had a whole group of people I was hanging out with, and it was super cool too. I just didn't mention them earlier because I didn't meet those people. I feel like they're family. Anyway, one of my favorite things about CES is hanging out with all those guys. We all stayed in Airbnb, and it can get a little bit rowdy, but it's still a lot of fun. But of course, I wasn't there to meet people, I was there to look at stuff. And so let me talk about some of those things that were really interesting, and I've broken these all into separate parts. So let's start with the ASUS booth, because there were some really interesting things here. Now, some of these things were really predictable. For example, they've got this new Z13 Flow, which is like a tablet with a really nice processor inside of it. I actually have one for review, so I'm testing it right now, but I did see that they're officially launched at their booth. In addition, they've got a new updated version of the ROG Nook, so this is something that I've already reviewed previously, but I want to take a look at this new one as well. It's going to be quite powerful. But it's funny, the computer that I was most interested in was just like a business or an office PC, but it reminded me of like a Dell Optiplex. And so I kind of want to get my hands on one of these and see what we can do with it in terms of just gaming and have like this kind of sleeper hit. And so if you are interested in me doing the same, let me know in the comments below. I actually already have a very similar smaller PC here at the house that I've been testing for a while from Mini's forum. And so I don't know, I think something about this kind of office style look just really appeals to me, as opposed to, all the RGB that you see everywhere else. But the real star of the show for me was that they have a new XG Mobile edition. So this will be the 4th one. And like with the other ones that they've released previously, this one is going to be a laptop GPU that you can take around and plug into other devices. But there are some major differences with this new model. Number one is the fact that it is Thunderbolt 5, which is a USB-C connection, which means that you can plug it into basically any existing handheld that supports USB 4 or Thunderbolt 4. All of those are going to work. In addition, because it is Thunderbolt 5, then future devices that are running with Thunderbolt 5 will also be compatible. And of course, it's not going to be just handhelds. Mini PCs and laptops, basically anything that has this connection will then be able to take advantage of this external GPU. And so I am very excited about this one, but it will have some limitations. For example, with Thunderbolt 5, it is going to have a limited bandwidth when it comes to GPU. So I think it's like 64 gigabit per second. So you're not going to be able to take full advantage of that GPU, but I love the idea of expanding the functionality of the stuff that you already own. It's also going to be very expensive, like in the $2,000 range. So definitely not something for everybody, but I love the implications of what this kind of means in terms of an external GPU setup to enhance the gameplay experience of all the things that you already have. Now, one thing that really was interesting about this whole trip was that it felt like the year of the handhelds. In the first year that I went, there were basically no handhelds at all. It was right around the time that the Steam Deck was coming out. And yeah, there was just no one talking about handhelds back then. Now, last year, things were different. We had like the Ally as well as the Legion Go. And so there was a bit of discussion, and the MSI Claw actually was announced during that time as well. So there was some stuff going on last year, but this year it seemed like everybody was talking about handhelds. And part of that has to do with the big Lenovo event that I already made a video about, and they basically had a joint event with AMD, and then Microsoft and Valve were there as well, and they talked about handhelds and gaming in the future, and they also showed off the 3 Lenovo Legion Go models. Again, I've talked about this in detail, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but they've got the Legion Go 2, and then they've got 2 lower end models that are called the Go S. One of them will be running with Windows and another one with official SteamOS. So that's the second thing that I thought was really cool, was just how many people were talking about handhelds and those new Lenovo models as well. And in addition to these handhelds from Lenovo, I did see quite a few others that were being shown off. The next I want to talk about is actually from MSI. Now, I reviewed the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus about a month ago, but they also upgraded their previous one, the 7-inch model, which they're now calling the 7 AI Plus. This one essentially is the same shell, but with some big improvements, including 2 USB ports, as well as the new chipset that we found in the 8 AI Plus, which is really performant. And then also they've upgraded the sticks and the bumpers, as well as the D-pad. And I think this one might become a bit of a sleeper hit because it has all the additional features and functionality of the new 8 AI Plus, but in that smaller form factor, and it's also going to be a lot cheaper. Well, it's not a lot cheaper, but it's $100 cheaper. So instead of spending $900, which I think is a little bit too much, this one is $800. So if that is within your price point, then this might be a better deal. Also, when I was at that booth, they had this really neat ham software that I talked about in my MSI Claw review, but they actually had it running here. And so essentially, as you walked by and you showed your hand, it would actually map everything and basically gauge the distance that you have, across your palm and your fingers and everything else. And they were basically doing that to everyone who walked by, and they've been doing it at multiple different trade shows as well. So the idea is they're collecting a bunch of hand metrics in terms of just overall sizes, so they can use this data to make a better handheld in the future. And so it's kind of cool because, we've got all sorts of hand sizes around the world, and so this kind of gives them an average to be able to work towards when they build out their next model. Now, in addition to the Lenovo as well as the MSI handhelds, there were a bunch of others around the trade show, and I honestly did not get to every one of them. For example, there was a huge 11-inch handheld from Tencent that I could never find. It was actually not in the gaming or PC section. It was totally on the other side of Vegas, so I never got to it. Same thing with the Acer handhelds. I think they announced 2 or 3 of them altogether. I was not able to find them and actually get some hands-on fun with it. So that's another handheld that will probably just have to wait for a different day. However, one company that I was able to track down was Zotac, and they actually had two different handhelds available to test out. There are two different handhelds, the Zone 1 and the Zone 2, and the Zone 1 has been out for quite some time, but it did not have a large launch here in the US. In fact, they only sent units to Micro Center, and there are no Micro Centers in Hawaii, and so I've never actually got my hands on one, at least until now. And this one is running an older chipset, about at the same power level as the Z1 Extreme, so the older Legion Go as well as the Ally and Ally X. So when it comes to performance, nothing really big here, but it was the new one, the Zotac 2, that was really interesting. This one is running the latest AMD HX370 chip, which has got the 890M Radeon GPU inside of it. It's actually pretty great, and I've done a lot of mini PCs reviews with it, but I haven't actually tested out one on a handheld, so this is my first experience. And this handheld is shaping up pretty nicely. The controls feel good. It feels like a handheld that's been made by a company who's been doing it for years. And so I really kind of went into the Zotac Zone not expecting much, but by the time I actually got my hands on it, I was like, wow, this might actually be a contender, and so that is definitely one to look out for. It's also got quite a few bells and whistles that we haven't seen on other handhelds, including a 7-inch OLED display at a 1080p resolution, so it looks great. And in terms of performance, I played a little bit of Horizon Forbidden West on it, and yeah, it was playing great. And so I am looking forward to this one. I think it'll probably come out this summer. And I think that's the majority of the handhelds that I tested out. I also went over to the OneXplayer booth. They had one this year, and I did see their new OneXFly, which has that same HX370 chip in the Zotac Zone 2, and I haven't tested this one either, but that one does look very good. The big thing that OneXplayer was showing off to me was their new G1 laptop. It basically looks like a GPD laptop, and this one is essentially going to be like a hybrid. So you can use the keyboard and you can pull the keyboard off and there are controls underneath. So this one is more like a hybrid gaming as well as workstation PC, and I will likely be reviewing one of these here in the future. And speaking of GPD and their laptop style hybrids, they did have a booth this year as well, so I did check them out. Most everything here I have reviewed before, but maybe not with those particular chipsets. So they had the Win Mini, the Pocket 4, the Win Max 2, as well as the GPD Win 4. And so in regards to GPD, it was just really cool to meet the team for the first time and kind of put a face behind the name, but I'm really happy that they were even at CES in the first place. That is one of the things that I kind of wish happened more often, that we would get some of these smaller handheld makers over there, like Ioneo or Ambernic or Retroid. Those would all really be cool, and they would probably make quite a splash at the show. But moving on from handhelds, let's talk a little bit about other controllers, because that's one of the other things I love to check out at CES, because there are just so many options. And always one of my favorite places to visit is the GameSir booth, because they always have a bunch going on. I really feel like last year was a banner year for this company. They released so many excellent handhelds and different options, and I actually wasn't able to review all of them because there were just so many that were launched and they were all decent. And it looks like 2025 is going to be a big year for them as well. They've got a lot of plans already. So I did see that they have a couple new color options for the Tarantula Pro. This is one of those controllers that I wasn't able to review in time, but they have a white color option as well as a PS1 like classic color option as well. These look really sharp. I really like this Tarantula Pro because it looks and feels like a PS4 controller, but a little bit more solid, and so I definitely need to get on my review for this one. They've also got a new telescopic controller. I think it's called the X5 Pro or something like that. I'm not really sure what the name is just yet, but it looks to kind of dethrone the G8 Galileo, which I've been loving for, over a year at this point. This one is a lot more compact, but the controls feel excellent. So I'm not really sure if I'm ready to replace my G8 Plus, but you never know. When I get this one in, I will test it out a little bit further. It does have some unique perks to it. For example, a cooling mechanism that you can put on the back of your phone and cool it down if you really want to play pretty intensely. Another thing that they are working on that's really neat is basically a clamp-on controller for your phone. So this is going to allow you to hold your phone vertically while playing some classic retro games, via apps like RetroArch as well as Delta. It definitely has a Game Boy look to it. Even the D-pad is very Game Boy DMG-esque. The nice thing about this one is that it's actually Bluetooth. A lot of the prototypes I've seen with a similar design like this require capacitive touch on the touchscreen, and that's really hard to line up. So I like the fact that they're actually just using a wireless Bluetooth signal. Anyway, this one was very much so a work in progress and just a prototype, and so if we do see something like this, I do expect it to change quite a bit when it goes into final production. Speaking of phone controllers, I was also finally able to meet up with Josh from MCon, who I've already made a video about with his previous controller. They now have a new prototype, which I was able to test out, and they've also launched their Kickstarter, and they've raised almost $1 million already. They've partnered with a company called OSnap, who makes a bunch of other phone accessories, and so it's really cool to kind of see all this coming together, and it definitely did make a lot of waves at CES. Now, the controller is still not finished. It feels like a pretty significant jump from the one that I tested to the one that they were showing off, but it also feels like there needs to be one other jump before the final production unit. But I did talk to the team and I asked them to send me out that Generation 2 one so I can do another video on it, because I want to document the progress of this from basically a teenager's mind all the way over into a finished product, and we're getting very close. I believe the controller is now going to come out sometime in August, so there's a little bit of time to make some tweaks, and they took a lot of feedback from me when I was just testing it out there on the fly. Regardless, I remain pretty hyped about this thing. I think that it could really change the way that we use mobile gaming, and to make something so slim and pocketable that you can kind of take around with you is a really awesome experience. Okay, one other controller thing I wanted to mention is that I went over to the Hyperkin suite and I checked out all of their stuff. And they've got quite a few things going on. They've got a new Xbox controller that kind of looks like a PS5 controller. So if you want to have that dual stick layout where the sticks are down below, they're working on a solution for that. Now, much like with any other third-party controller that works on an Xbox, it has to be wired, which is unfortunate, but that's just kind of how it goes when it comes to licensing. And this was also not a finished product, so they had some texture things that they need to work through, but I can tell you just in general, from holding it, it does feel very good. That's actually one of the things I like about Hyperkin. After talking to the team, it seems like they're just making things that are solutions to their own problems. So for example, one of the guys there was like, yeah, I grew up with a PlayStation. I want to play with a PlayStation controller, but on an Xbox because of Game Pass, because it's just such an alluring idea right now. And so that's why they made the controller. And I love it when people make solutions to their own problems. I think that's always going to make a better product. They also showed off their latest version of the Mega 95 handheld. So this is something that I talked about in my last CES video because they had it back then. And so this essentially is a portable Genesis. So you can plug in your cartridges and play directly on the handheld. It's got that, Sega Genesis 6-button layout and everything, but it also comes with a dock. So you can dock this thing and then just use it as a retro console. And the dock itself is compatible with original Genesis controllers or, one of the Hyperkins, because they have some remakes as well. And this one is still being worked on, but I will say that it feels a lot better than it did last year. The texture of the plastics, the ergonomics feel a little bit better in the hand. So this is probably something more for just an average consumer as opposed to a gaming enthusiast, but it is going to be really cool if they actually have this in stores, that someone can walk by and be like, oh wow, there's now a new Genesis, and for whatever the price is going to be, probably around $100, but it also has a dock on it so they can play that on their TV or in their hand, and I like that mobility function. It essentially is a Nintendo Switch where you can play your old Sega Genesis cartridges, and so I think that's going to be a nice alternative as opposed to going to a retro game store and buying up like an old used Sega Genesis and then a bunch of cartridges. You can just kind of do everything with this one. But the real star of the show within their booth was something I wasn't expecting, but they are re-releasing their original Guitar Hero controller that is for the Nintendo Wii. But to be clear here, this is not an update. They are basically just making it available again. Now, personally, I loved all of those rhythm games back in the mid-2000s. I played a lot of Guitar Hero as well as Rock Band. But if you try to go online right now and buy some of that older equipment, there's nothing available. So you basically have to buy them used on eBay, and the prices are going to skyrocket, and the quality is also going to be diminished. After all, it's been about 15 years since these peripherals first released, and so they are showing their age. And so essentially what Hyperkin did is they figured out that they still had their old molds from the old plastic one that they had made, so they made new shells and then they inserted a new PCB, and so they're basically just making it available again. And so really it's just kind of a win-win in that if you are trying to play Guitar Hero on a Wii, then instead of having to buy like a second-hand one that's going to be a lot more expensive, you can now buy a brand new one from Hyperkin. And so I appreciate the fact that they're doing this, even though it is not an updated model. But speaking of which, they did say that they are working on some new stuff. And so I don't really have any other data other than that, but it does sound like obviously there's going to be something else coming on down the pike. And honestly, I'm pretty excited about this concept to the point where, I don't know, I think I might actually get one of these for review and then see how it works with emulation. Like, what if we can buy a Wiimote, we can stick it inside of this thing and then play it on a handheld or something? I'm not sure how Dolphin works with an original Wiimote, but it's something that I'm interested in exploring. So if you want to see a video like that, let me know in the comments below. Okay, moving away from handhelds and controllers, let's talk about the two last things that I thought were really cool. The first one is kind of boring, but actually a little bit exciting for me, and that is charging. Now, I think a lot of people associate Ugreen with charging when it comes to handhelds and other peripherals, and that's because they're pretty aggressive in their marketing. They send out samples to everybody. I get a bunch of samples from Ugreen, and so it's pretty easy to use their stuff, and I do like it. I think they make really high quality stuff, but I also like another company, and that's the one I used before I even knew about Ugreen, and that's Anker. And Anker had a booth, and so I walked over to those guys and I was like, hey, why is it that you don't do anything related to gaming? You know, you focus a lot on like charging for a laptop or whatever, but what about these gaming devices? What about a Steam Deck? What about an ROG Ally? What about my other devices? And so we had a long talk about that kind of stuff, and they had a product there that I thought was really interesting, and I think I would really love to use it with my stuff. And this thing is called the Anker Prime Charger, and it's going to be a 250 watt charger with 6 different outputs. On the front, you've got 4 USB-C ports, and then on the right side, you've got 2 USB-A ports as well. So it can basically charge a lot of things at once. Now, because it's only 250 watts, that means you'll have to share the wattage between them, but that's actually where it gets really interesting. It's got this little dial on the right side that you can also push in for a button, and it basically allows you to set your charging priority based on what you have plugged in. And so, for example, if you plug in 3 things into your USB-C ports, then generally, you know, the most powerful port will get the most juice and kind of trickle down from there. The thing that's unique about this one is that if you decide that you want to give more power to one of the other ports, you can just dial over to it using that little dial thing and then choose that one to get charging priority. And so essentially you can charge your devices when you want to and how you want to, not based on which plug you're using, but actually just what you choose in the dial. And I thought that was really handy because I spend a lot of time swapping out my ports and cables and whatnot with my various devices depending on what I'm charging. So either way, if I get my hands on this, I might do a review, but I just thought it was pretty neat. It's expensive. I think it's like $170, but that's the kind of thing that's like a forever charger for me. Like I can put it on my desk and then use that for all the various handhelds that I have, and I think that'll be really handy. And finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about were keyboards. Now, this is not something I know a lot about, but I know that when I use a keyboard and I like it, then I like it. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more on this trip. So I started by going over to NuPhy and checking out their keyboards. You know, that's usually what I primarily will use for my desktops. And they have this new one that's actually a high profile or low profile keyboard, and you can swap out everything. And so I think that's really cool. So that is something that I'm interested in possibly reviewing. Again, let me know in the comments down below if it seems like something you'd like to see as well. But honestly, the thing that interested me even more was from a different company called Keychron. I've used a lot of their keyboards over the years, but it's been some time since I've tested one out, and they've done a lot of work since then. And the latest one is actually really interesting. It's called the K2HE. Now, the HE stands for Hall Effect, and as you can imagine, that means it has an analog input on the key itself, which is really crazy. So think about it this way. You can determine when to actuate the key. So you can press it just lightly and it'll actually function, or you can make it a little bit heavier in case you're like a heavy typer. And even though this is geared more towards like, you know, getting that perfect balance when you're typing, because it's an analog input, that has some implications when it comes to gaming. So for example, if these keys have an analog input, that means that you could potentially use them for stuff like racing games. So if you have your gas pedal set to one of the keys, when you press it, you'll be able to press that key down. And so that might be really interesting. In addition, if you're playing a game that requires a very light touch, like very precise and quick movement, then you can set that really high. And so you can just barely tap it and it'll work. Or for example, my son played through Super Mario 64 PC port using his keyboard and mouse, and he essentially just used running the entire time because there's no analog input. So there was no way for him to make Mario walk. He just had to push forward the entire time. So this will basically change all of that for him. So he can choose how quickly Mario runs as he presses down the key. And so things like that are actually really interesting to me, that you can use a keyboard, something you wouldn't think about when it comes to analog input, but for an analog input style game. Anyway, I am also interested in reviewing that one, but again, it's all about feedback. You know, I don't want to become a keyboard reviewer, so let me know what stuff among all the stuff that you've seen throughout this video is the most interesting to you, and I'll prioritize my video output from there. Regardless, I had a great time at CES. I hung out with a bunch of people, you know, did a little bit of partying, not too much, and then also had some great food. And so, you know, this is one of my favorite times of the year, is just to kind of check out and celebrate all this new tech, and I hope you've enjoyed watching my video recap of it as well. I'm not sure how many more trips like this I'll go on throughout this year, but there are a couple I have my eye on. Either way, I'll keep you apprised with that, and I'll obviously do a recap or travel video when I get back as well. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.